Um, Good evening, everybody. This lecture is sponsored by the AIAS chapter at Virginia Tech. Our guest this evening is Florian Eidenberg, co-founder of the Brooklyn-based award-winning firm SOIL. Just a reminder that this lecture is being recorded for the school's distributive purposes. We'll be having a small Q&A after the lecture, so if you have any questions during the lecture, feel free to stick around afterwards. You can either ask your questions in the chat, you can send them directly to me or Florian, or feel free to turn on your camera and microphone and raise your hand and ask your question face to face. So a little bit about Florian. Florian was born in the Netherlands and studied at Delft University of Technology, where he received his master's degree in 1999. He then went on to work at SANAA, where he was in charge of the design and realization of the Glass Pavilion at the Toledo Museum of Art and the new Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. Florian then co-founded SOIL in 2008 along with Jing Liu. From their website, in a digitized world that increasingly draws one inward, our architecture is outward looking, engendering meaningful dialogue with what is materially and psychologically outside of ourselves. The firm has completed projects in the cities of Lyon, Lisbon, Seoul, and their hometown of Brooklyn. Seoul has been recognized internationally with some awards, including the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Prize in 2010, the AIA New Practices Award in 2010, Prix de Rome in 2014, the J. Irwin and Xenia Miller Prize in 2019, and many more. Their collections have been included in the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the National Gallery of Victoria, and many other private collections. So please join me in welcoming Florian.
Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin, and everybody for inviting me. I will share my screen now, I guess, which actually, yeah. So, yeah, it's nice. It's the first time I lecture at your guys' school. Again, thank you for inviting. I will speak about some of the projects that are maybe less known. There's a few things that when you Google us, you see these images come by, but I'm going to show some stuff that's maybe more recent or that has been in the works over the last few years, but has not been shared so much. First of all, so this is our office right before the Corona crisis sort of went loose, so pretty much like a year and a little bit ago on our roof. We always throw an office party around Chinese New Year, and here we made sort of this large inflatable bubble on our roof just as one of the fun part of our office, and took this picture. And pretty much, I think that was sort of a super spreader event. I think very quickly after we were all working from home, but it shows basically our office and also hopefully a little bit the attitude of our office. So we're very hands-on, very experimental. It's very much about sort of people participating in the project itself. You see Jing Liu, my partner, right there in the middle. But it is very, everything I will share with you is stuff we do together as an office. And I think for us, the way we work, we really. Yeah, it's very much something in dialogue. So I will be, the one speaking, but it's a lot of people with whom we do this work together. And then suddenly we were all stuck in our homes, and all these different sort of activities started to happen, and we started to become very disconnected in a way from the work. For us, it's a very physical activity. We make a lot of models, and we work sort of together. And I don't know if you guys know Jan de Wilder and Inge de Vink. They are the Vink de Wilder Atelier. They're Belgian architects, and they did one. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on during COVID, but they basically asked a number of architects to contribute to a magazine they were making, and the question was, make a drawing without anything else than the drawing itself. Right, so something that does not represent your work, that doesn't stand for anything, that is completely, disconnected, so to say, and it's just for the sake of drawing. And today I want to speak about lines and the act of drawing, but actually much more about the relationship between the lines we draw and the sort of implications they have on the world behind us. Because I think another thing that this year sort of taught us is that we are all extremely, connected to one another, and that all our actions have effects on others. And so lines, and I originally thought I should call this lecture lines, because in some way that's what we do, right? As architects, all we do is draw lines. We draw doodles in a very sort of naive manner, maybe. And sometimes it is, they have sort of an impact. These are some sketches. I just took some pictures from, from my desk. I like to draw behind the computer more than on Zoom. But basically, they sort of tell you how a roof panel gets divided. Your lines are where the water goes. Maybe, an angle of a fireplace, or and I like also these digital lines today, right? And probably you have it also on your desk grids, where suddenly, there's like all these different styles of line drawing, but they actually, all these lines, they're not so innocent. And that's a little bit my point. And it is something that we've been thinking about in our office and in dialogue with Jing quite a bit. Is like, what are the lines, but also what are the effects of our line? They sort of decide. This is a project that will open in Brooklyn today, where, for instance, it will be hardscape and where it will be softscape. So where will there be growth? Where will plants grow, and where will animals be, so to say? Or they have labor implications here. This is a early project we did for a Tina Kim gallery, a transformation, but sort of the curved line and the way the strings come up, they actually describe, or they produce, labor actions, right? Sort of people that have to move material in a certain place. And we, are we thinking enough about this on a larger scale, right? If we draw lines on maps and on the landscape, they have an impact of where people live and what their economic chances are. And so, what are the labor implications if we specify a certain material? Who actually, will have work to do, and who won't have work to do, and what do those labor processes look like? What parts of the earth is this a marble a mine or marble quarry in Italy, right? If you specify a counter for your kitchen, it sets in motion a number of movements that also involve sort of the stripping of pieces of the earth, and ultimately also in our choices, we also decide where that material ends up. And so we've been thinking a little bit in the office, and obviously we started in 2008. We started during the economic crisis, really right before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and so we've always seen sort of the relationship between our actions and, say, the economy, or larger sort of contexts in which we operate. And so today, rather than talking about lines, I wanted to talk about a few of our projects sort of with the strings attached, meaning all the projects we are involved in, they are connected to people's histories, to people's storylines, and to timelines, or they are connected to material supply chain, the whole sequence of materials from where they come from to where they go. And it speaks about also transformations and adaptive reuse. And the last sort of line or lineage I'd like to talk about is sort of capital, and where does the budget of the construction go, and what are the labor practices, and how that involves sort of certain groups. So all to say is we feel in this last year it became clear that there are certain aspects of society where sometimes you're wondering, as an architect, what can we do, or what's the effect of our actions. And what we're trying to show in these projects is actually that in the lines that you draw, right, in the decisions you make on paper, you actually can have very direct effect on people, on social conditions, on ecological conditions. And this is hopefully helps you think about that a little bit. So I'm going to show 3 projects, I think 4, maybe with some small pieces in between, on various scales. And this is a very large one, and it starts in Western New York at the Niagara Gorge, where we have been working over the last few years with an organization called Art Park. And Art Park is located here at the end of the Niagara Gorge, pretty much close to Canada, Lake Ontario, in the town called Lewiston. This is an old map from 1934. Here you see the Niagara Falls, you see Niagara Falls town. And this is actually a map made by a train company to argue for the sort of beautiful touristic journey from Niagara Falls down to Lewiston. And our task in many ways was a similar sort of task. Art Park, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, was a site that has a very storied history. And the question was, how can we get the 8 million people that come to Niagara Falls over the year spend some time to come down the gorge to Art Park and enjoy that space. But Art Park is a very interesting and complex space and place. And today in this talk, I will try to speak to you about the layers of history and what does it mean to engage with that. And obviously, you know, if we think about this area of the U.S., but you know, many places of the U.S., there are different layers of time that you start to unravel once you start thinking about it. And I think it's important here. This is Lewiston, which was burned in 1813, but there is here what is described in 1934 as the site of an Indian village. And if you look at also how the person who's drawing the map is depicted, these are questions we would have today, but it's clearly sort of a sign of its time. And so what you see here also is a very dramatic drop in the landscape, and that's an important thing to remember. And this bridge is another character that will reappear. So this story actually starts in 1956. The Niagara Gorge is very important for the energy production in Western New York, and actually a lot of the wealth in New York State comes from the hydropower of the Niagara Gorge. And so in 1956, one of the power stations, the Sholkop power station, actually collapsed, and it fell into the gorge itself, and New York State was out of power. And there was a big crisis because this is after the war, and there's a lot of industries were starting, and you know, it was the sort of post-war boom, and fridges had to be produced. There's a lot of automotive industry. General Electric has a plant there. And so the industry said, well, if you don't bring this power back very quickly, we have to relocate. And so they brought in Robert Moses. Robert Moses, famous, builder, maker of New York City. Nelson Rockefeller brought him in, and within 3 years, they were able to build the largest hydropower plant in the Western world at that moment, close to Lewiston, along the gorge. What you also see here is that they needed to dig a big lake that was necessary to sort of retain the water as part of this infrastructural project. It also meant that they actually had to displace the Tuscarora Indian Reserve. And so there's, here on the left, you see the engineers, working on that lake, but there were two First Nation communities on that site where the lake was dug, and they took it to the Supreme Court because they basically said, you're taking our land and you're pushing it away. And here you see where that village was, right where the lake was dug. Here's Lewiston. But up in the Supreme Court, basically the decision was that the power of the nation is more important than the right to the land of this First Nation. And so they were moved, and they were the earth was basically taken away from them, and had a really negative effect on their economic well-being. The two other sort of interesting spots here, and here this is the site that we're talking about. Here you see the lake that was dug where the First Nation had their communities, and here's the power plant. Also, there's the Niagara Falls storage site, which was used for storing uranium and other radioactive waste from the atom bomb and the Manhattan Project, which happened nearby. And so there's also this fear that when this was dug, here you see the lake and the Niagara. So basically this whole area is a place where the land is being used and moved and uprooted, and things are buried. So this is the site, Art Park. It wasn't called Art Park at that moment. It was a landfill. Here's the Lewiston. And basically when they dug this lake, they dumped all this soil here on this edge of that ravine that we saw before. In the old map, there was that sort of slope. They just sort of filled it up. They made it a little bit longer. And here you see them building this pile basically of waste and wasteland. They spared very closely the Lewiston Mound, which is another Hopewell burial site nearby. It also sits on this site. It's actually here, and here you see sort of the before on the left and the after with the mount, and here you see this landfill that was being produced. And so they didn't really know what to do with all this. And so they had all this land, and what they then decided to do is give a lot of money. Rockefeller, as a governor at that moment, gave a lot of money to let artists work on this site. And so actually for 10 years, it was a very productive and sort of fertile site where really land art sort of found its bearings, so to say. There was obviously, you guys know a little bit about the history of land art, and a lot of that happened, in the deserts, with the Smithsons and Roden Crater and what have you. But many artists didn't have the money and the resources to go so far west. So actually, a lot of New York artists ended up, doing their work on Art Park, and that's been a very productive site in those 10 years for this whole movement of within the arts world. And so a few examples is Gordon Matta Clark, who did his bingo. On the left, you see an image, a press image of that hydro station that collapsed that I showed you before. And here is his work, Bingo, in some ways sort of a reenactment of this idea of collapse down the gorge. There's other works, more sort of sensitive. Alan Somfist made a circle of rocks and basically waited until the seeds would be captured by this sort of crater and start to produce green on this landfill. There's a lot of female artists who were able to do more sensitive work with regards to sort of the sort of emergence of an ecological thinking. This is Nancy Holt is a famous land artist whose husband was Robert Smithson, and basically the grant that sort of started Art Park was in their name. But also more sort of say intense works that sort of went deeper into the earth. Ant Farm, they buried their time capsule there in that ground, and it's supposed to be dug up now, or actually it was supposed to be dug up around 2000, but since they don't know how much radioactivity is in the site, nobody's allowed to dig in the site anymore. And also Chris Burden did his famous beam drop there, which is probably one of the most sort of violent works of land art, where he takes I-beams and he sort of drops them from super high with a crane into a pool of concrete. And you cannot maybe imagine a more aggressive way of dealing with our soil, so to say. And then over the later years, it became more sort of a community park, still well funded. And they built actually a very large stage here for an audience much larger than the entire region could support. But the local governor liked the opera, or the local it's like not the governor, but basically the regional director. He liked opera, and so he pushed for that. And it was an important site for many people in the community, and it became a real destination for a number of years. But however, over time, and this is when we were called in, this is a few years ago, the site still has its infrastructure, but it doesn't have its life anymore. It's a beautiful natural site with a very dramatic drop, but it's mostly empty and mostly abandoned, and it doesn't have the funding anymore, it doesn't have the programming anymore, and it actually has sort of all this history in a way buried underneath in the ground here, and all these stories of different occupants over time are embedded within this soil. But when you come there, it actually just doesn't look like much is going on. The only thing that they do have is every summer they have 12 classic rock concerts on Sundays, and that's when people still come, and so the place is much more understood as a venue for these 12 concerts, and the rest of the year it's pretty much empty. And so we were called in through a competition together with West 8 landscape designers who did Governor's Island in New York, and Charcoal Blue, which is like a theater and performance venue consultant who know a lot about basically venues, to rethink this site with all this history. And they asked us for a master plan. And we don't believe in today's day and age that you can make a master plan. A master plan, first of all, suggests that there's a master, and second of all, that the plans we make can actually be executed. And secondly, we felt very, and the more we sort of read about sort of the history and the incredible complexity of this land, that the last thing we wanted to do is add another layer of like acting upon this land and like sort of putting another sort of, you're seeing it again as a blank slate that just could be sort of taken. And so, and I would say, and I'll admit this, it was the most sort of complex question that we've ever faced as a practice, and it was very meaningful to really be challenged by such dense history. And I summarized, there's like many more stories about this land, of course. And so the first thing we did is actually start to listen, and we brought a lot of the community together. And now it's a lot of old people there in Lewiston who have been there for many years and had the sort of the experience of what this place was in the 80s. But it's very nostalgic, mostly sort of question of those were good old days when there was a lot of money invested in this place, and there was a lot of it was sort of reminiscent of the history of this place as really a community center and a place where the community could come together around culture. Also, we actually walked the site with a few representatives of some of the First Nation communities that had their own versions and experiences of the site, and helped us look at the site in a completely through a completely different lens, to just actually see the site from a different perspective. And we also met people who were interested in investing in the site and figuring out how could they make this work, because obviously a site like this cannot just work, and especially today in this day and age is not being funded by large sort of governmental programs. So how would we be able to bring life back to the site, but also offer some opportunity for people to start businesses or be entrepreneurs within that. And we went to a classic rock concert, of course. We were fortunate enough to see Sammy Hagar with Jason Bonham on drums, the son of the famous John Bonham of Led Zeppelin. And Sammy Hagar, he pretty much summarized sort of the problem of the scope to us. He said, I'm 72, I really like it here, but I'm going to be dead in 10 years, and all of you in the audience as well. So, please come back for the next 10 years, because afterwards, I don't know what's going to happen. And that was exactly sort of the brief that we were given. It's like, rethink this place so that it can actually be a place that has a longer, or like maybe a new narrative, or the next sort of few decades of this site. And that was when our first scribbles and lines did appear, but they were mostly not new lines, but actually the sort of mapping and the understanding and the sort of revealing of all these different histories and all these different times of when was this land sort of constructed, and how was it made. And we thought what would be important is, rather than sort of telling a new story, how can we make all the stories that are sort of embedded within the site be experienced by people that would come here. So just by coming there, you would understand sort of the complexity of something that I just explained to you. And we started to make some of these collages, and we wanted to be very careful with how we engaged with the land itself. We wanted to also reveal that this land it's not just beautiful natural site, but it is really a constructed landscape, and it is an artificial landscape. And I forgot to say, but it's very important, the site is actually owned and managed by the New York Power Authority. Since they dumped the land there, they're actually the owner of the site, and they're also responsible for the site. And there is this interest and desire, because hydropower is obviously a very sustainable way of producing energy, is that this site would also be something that could speak to alternative ways of energy production, and a much more green and future forward way of thinking how we generate our power. So there was also this idea of some sort of optimistic technological say, narrative that we try to embed within it. So some of these collages that we produced, they were very much about framing what is there or reorganizing and just working with what's there. But they were sort of guide, we use them to guide our conversations and to provoke discussions. How do we deal with this, very dramatic drop? How do we deal with this almost say ecological and geological time? Interestingly enough, originally the Niagara Falls were 10,000 years ago right at the site of Art Park, and only gradually over 10,000 years they had moved up towards Niagara Falls where it is now. So how do you show all these different layers of time and reveal them with a project? And so these images were quite important because they sort of started to speak about sort of a certain attitude that had to do with unearthing literally the history of this site. And then rather than a master plan, we really spoke about sort of different steps the organization could take. And this is like a 30-year sort of time frame, and it is literally, it's more like giving the organization there the opportunity to take certain paths and see also where is interest, where is funding, where are people where can they create sort of this new traction of bringing life onto the site. And the first and the most important thing was actually to use what they now have and strengthen that, which is, and I will not speak to all these projects because it can take hours, but basically to sort of improve their place as a venue, but also extend the season of that site that is now mostly dead. The second phase had more to do with bringing back the sort of the idea of art production on the site, and the last was really dealing with that theater, and I won't speak about that. I will just speak about sort of what we did for the first phase, which hopefully will get started relatively soon. So important for us, and as I mentioned, is to how to reveal this history of this thing being a landfill. And what we actually decided to do is take the old truck route. So this has to do with the turning radius of the truck, as it comes down and slopes down, and you see it here, to use that and to sort of reinforce it as the backbone of the park. So that's the place that people find orientation in. It's like a red carpet, so to say, that really meanders through the different layers. There's a very dramatic drop from up here at the ridge all the way down to the water there. And so make that, which is basically shaped through history, make that sort of the backbone of the park. And I'll explain now the amphitheater, which we is now in a sort of somewhat like dilapidated stage, and our proposal for how to bring that back. But it is very much integrated within this path itself, that here actually is the sort of center organization of this amphitheater, and also where the concessions are along. And as you see here, we wanted to make a place that is not just an amphitheater, but also something that can be used throughout the year when nothing is going on, as a somewhat fascinating and interesting landscape. And we started to think of this idea of artificiality, which this is a constructed landscape. So how do we make that artificiality visible? And we were interested in these sort of somewhat surreal, maybe knolls of the landscape that only at certain moments can be used, as viewing. So can we imagine this amphitheater as something that has two settings? One, in sort of the when there's nothing going on, that still has a certain interest and a certain presence, and then when the concerts happen, it sort of transforms into this venue. And so we started to work together with West 8, our landscape designers, on sort of amphitheater, but fully made out of these artificial knolls, sort of these artificial hills. So producing a vineyard seating, if you want, but by shaping these knolls with a lawn into the sightlines for this 10,000 people music venue. And so there's in the stadium design, you always have different sort of hierarchies of also ticketing. There's people that want to be in the mosh pit, there's people that want to sit more comfortably. There's always VIP booths for their sponsors and other people that make this stuff possible. And so we started to do this whole sort of planning of the seating, but through developing these different types of knolls of different capacities. And then, importantly, of course, the sightlines here, the venue, which, during the off season would just be an interesting structure, and during the season would become this real focal point. But also the idea that this whole bowl would be very, have a beautiful view towards the gorge itself, and people would also be able to come out and hang out here and picnic and just enjoy, the view of the nature, because here is basically the gorge. On the other side is Canada. You can just come and watch Canada if you want for a while. And so this you see it, in its natural setting, and then when it turns into a venue with all the concessions here along the path under the mounds, so to say. And also, during the season, so in the summer it would be a place for hiking, and the winter it could be a fun place also for cross-country skiing or sleighing. So here you see the imagery, and currently this is in sort of a funding phase at the state, and hopefully can be organized. And I wanted to speak about this last feature and last sort of element, which is the band shell, the stage, and its sort of a roof. And here we wanted to channel some of this idea of the experiment and the somewhat maybe even nostalgic notion of a technological progression, so to say. And I've been very interested in different structural engineers. I think as architects we can learn a lot about architecture and how stuff goes together by studying engineers. And this is Robert Le Ricollet. This is a French dude over here, but he worked a lot with Louis Kahn also. This is one of the things he did. And he did the sort of very experimental tensegrity structures. And those are structures where, you have cables and sort of fixed pieces that together form sort of these space structures. And so we took one of his concepts and actually thought, what if the stage itself has this as a roof structure, that during the off season is just hanging there as some sort of mysterious element, and then during the concert series can be clad in this ETFE cover, which actually has solar shingles on the top, because the idea of the entire park was that it would be fully run on renewable energy. It's very fascinating to learn how much energy actually a rock concert requires and how much waste it produces. And so there was a real desire to try to refigure out how can we make these events so that they have less impact on the planet, both through the waste that they produce and the energy that they consume. And so the idea was basically that the entire park could generate its own energy over the course of the year to allow for these concerts to continue to happen the way they happen, but without sort of power from elsewhere. And so that's where I'm going to leave this plan. But this is something where I think for us the way in which we looked at the lineages and the lines of history very much informed our thinking for the design. Oh yeah, we recently did an installation in Atlanta, and this speaks about thinking about material lineages as well, and how do we think of what happens to the stuff afterwards. And so while this project is in the works and in the funding, last summer we did this temporary installation at the High Museum in Atlanta that actually speaks about birds and migration. It's called Murmuration, and it was about to close down. And I said, well, Whoopi, what are you going to do with it? And they said, well, we're just probably going to get rid of it. And I was wondering what get rid of means. But basically, he said, well, we're going to put it in the dumpster. And so I was actually, I called the director of Art Park and said, do you guys want to have it? And now it's being reinstalled there actually as a permanent installation. And so more and more we start to think about, what do we do with this stuff afterwards, and so where does it come from and where does it go afterwards? And I think it's really something as architects we should start being more aware of. It's like, what happens to your buildings afterwards? And that will take me to a short small second project that I will share with you that we did, I think 2-3 years ago in Columbus, Indiana. And it is, you have Exhibit Columbus, which is basically every 2 years, like a biannual, where they ask younger architects to do some installation, mostly to respond to the incredible history and legacy that Columbus, Indiana has with regards to architecture and the architecture that has been produced there, because it has really amazing churches by Saarinen, both father and son, and there's an IMP library. Kevin Roche did a bunch of buildings there. There's a Venturi fire station, and all these civic buildings, all these public buildings in a quite small town of 35,000 people were mostly paid for by Mr. Miller, and Mr. Miller and his wife Xenia. They were, well, he was the head of Cummins Engines, which is a company that make diesel engines, and they basically funded all design of all public buildings, all the architectural fees, because they thought design is important. And our own house is a famous destination. And if you ever get a chance to be around there in Indiana, you should certainly go by, because he had designed the Miller House by Saarinen, together with Dan Kiley as a landscape designer and Alexander Girard as the interior designer. And so when we came there, we walked through the garden. Dan Kiley's a famous modernist landscape designer, and they said, you know, we're gonna replace the hedges soon. Oh, here you see Xenia Simmons Miller and her husband Joseph Urban Miller. So this is some of the projects that they helped realize. She had a very good taste, and she picked the architects and brought them in. And they built pretty much, you know, all the public buildings in that town, and you see them there in their house. They've both passed, but so this Columbus or this exhibit Columbus is to really honor their legacy and to bring you know, designers into this town. And so when we came there, we learned that the hedges, and you see them here in the middle. This is the Dan Kiley hedge. They were going to replace it because they were about to die, and so we thought, why don't we do an installation? Because our installation needed to be in the center of town, in the most public space. But why don't we anticipate what will happen to our installation afterwards? And so we took cues from Dan Kiley, and we took cues from Alexander Girard, who on the left developed these patterns together with Miss Miller, specifically for this house. And we said, why don't we make an installation that people can enjoy before it becomes part of the Miller house? And in the middle, you see the hedges that Dan Kiley imagined. They were there to separate the private house from the public space. And we said, why don't we make an installation where once people can actually enjoy being in the hedge, so to say, not using the hedge as a separation between public and private, but in this most public spot of Columbus, on the main sort of crossing as you enter town. We used all the plants that were going to go into the hedge as an experience for people to enjoy, to enter as a public space. And then we produced a series of seating and hammocks, you know, sort of channeling the patterns of Alexander Girard, that later were also actually recycled and used in other places and spots. And so for the season, for the course of this project, they were sitting there on the lawn, and they were planted, and actually recently they have been inserted into the hedge itself. And so that idea of you know, thinking through the life cycle of the materials we deal with, I think, is something that we're more and more getting sort of interested in. And that brings us to also the idea of adaptive reuse, because obviously when we start thinking about energy and materials, the most mileage you can get out of a project and out of a material is if you can reuse a building itself. And recently we completed our first sort of large adaptive reuse project in New York City for this Egyptian artist, Ghada Amer. She's a very well-known and quite controversial artist. She works, she uses very basically pornographic imagery, and then starts to embroider them and work with thread in a very laborious process to turn them into large sort of murals that are three-dimensional, made mostly by thread, and it raises questions of gender and labor. And sometimes they become so dense they actually start to look like Arabic script as well. So it's a very complex set of work. She works together also with her partner Reza, and here we are visiting her studio because she found a place where she wanted to build her and Reza's studio in Harlem, and this is where we are trying to understand the process. The site she had found was actually a burned out church in Harlem that was you know, empty, and had stood there empty and abandoned for a number of years. And you see here quite interesting, but deteriorating facade. And these were originally 2 townhouses, and imagine the images here on the left, they were the same here. There was a development of 4 townhouses, and they had gradually transformed, and they had added this layer of brick into this facade. And this is the church was not being used anymore. And she was able to buy the place really as it was completely burned out. So it was a complete sort of what people would say tear down. And the most logic thing at that moment is to sort of tear it down. And often it's more expensive actually to keep what is there. But then together we said, well, there is life here, there's a history here, and also these materials, they still have a lot of life left in them, so to say. And often demolition produces a lot of waste, produces a lot of energy. So can we not salvage and transform this place? And it was quite straightforward in the way we needed to use it. We kept all the structural walls in the middle. We maybe made an opening here or there. And as you saw, she uses both like wet area and then just large space to work in. And so the plan is quite straightforward. We put all the circulation and the wet areas, and so that is both like bathrooms, but also sort of places for her, like with large sinks to work behind as sort of a backbone, and in front, at different heights, at different floors, studio space and a space, archive space. So basically they could both work there. And on the top, we extended it with a little volume where she could have dinners and receive friends and have a balcony. So the plan was very easy, but the facade was incredibly hard because the facade fell off. We couldn't salvage that old facade. It was actually peeling off. And so we had to think of a new facade. And here you see, because this is 2014, actually the project started in 2013. And in 2019, we're still working on the facade. I don't know if you guys, I mean, I teach as well, and often people don't even get to the facade, and it's actually really hard to think about a facade. But here, between the facade peeling and the facade, there's pretty much 5 years of trying to figure out how we could actually, get this facade designed. And she refused over and over. She didn't like what we were doing. It was very hard. We were at that moment, our office was a little bit younger. We thought we needed to make a big statement. This is like a building in Manhattan. What can we do? And ultimately, we came across this image, which was the original facade before the church was there. And you see that it's actually just a mirroring from the 2 other buildings on the left. Not exactly. You see, there's some sort of difference, but there is also a lot of similarity. We thought, well, maybe we can work by just bringing back what was there, but let's not bring it back in a sort of fake historic way. Let's work with an abstraction or sort of an interpretation of this idea. And we started to say maybe the design should not happen on the sort of scale of the building as a whole, but maybe it should just happen on the scale of the detail. And we said, wouldn't it be cool to make just these openings without anything else? And here you see a little bit of the detail, but basically we built a big model to show it, and later we built a mock-up in the basement of the space to show what we were trying to do. We were trying to just make this opening actually as almost a punch through this brick wall without any arches or support or what have you. Here's Gara, very happy and excited about it. We finally had a conclusion after 5 years of struggling. This is true. And so the facade came down, and here you see the bricklayers putting it back with these arches. And here you see the on the right, the brick sort of appearing, and literally sort of the joints and everything just continues. Look at the thin sort of layered brick, as if it was cut like a cookie cutter out of this facade. And this is very recently. Still, there's a little bit of work to do. You see some of the paint still has to happen. These shots are like a few weeks ago, but she's in there and she's working now. This is all the new work that is coming to be. Reza, her partner, is doing a dance performance on the lower level, working with dancers there during COVID. And here she is up on the with her large canvases, embroidering and working away. As a joke, they did the bathrooms in a way using some of the imagery that they use. So this they made Mexico ceramic tiles, the roof terrace, and the facade. And so here you see it, and really the facade in some way fits in sort of its context, and at the same time clearly is sort of also a layer with a different world, right, that happens sort of behind it. And we're quite excited about the way this turned out with the front door. So that's really our most recent project. There's a few more projects this year that are coming online, but this is one of the ones we've been working on the longest, so to say. And maybe it's because we dealt with so much history that it took also a long time to get it complete. And this starts to talk about, and I started to introduce it a little bit already, the notion of labor and who actually makes our buildings, and how, as we make these decisions, do we make decisions also about other people's work, and who gets work, so to say, and who doesn't, right? If you decide to design things in a certain way. We made a project, which was our first project in Seoul, in Korea, where we designed this building, and then we designed sort of a dress for it of 500,000 rings that were hand welded together. We went to China, to a village, and we worked together there in actually developing a method to produce these 500,000 rings that drape this building, and they were installed by actually fishermen or people who work with fish netting, because it was such a unique sort of thing. And this is now 10 years ago, but it very early on confronted us very much with this idea also of how do you make your buildings, and with whom do you work on making your buildings. And so I like to contrast this image of the sort of very archaic handicraft and a very sort of improvised way of making a building of a certain appearance, right? Where we decide that this sort of double curvature and this idea of this mesh was an important feature. And a very different type of building we also completed also in Asia, also for the arts, and also something with a very particular skin, but a very different type of skin. Also, it has a certain depth. It also has curves, but it has a lot of repetition, and it is made out of very large units. So from the very small unit to the ring to these very large glass cylinders that are 30 feet tall, pretty much. And they could only be made actually in Germany by the company that also does the Apple stores on this very large beds, Sealy, and they only have the capacity to deal with these large pieces. It's all automated. It's all with laser precision. It's all machines. It's almost like a laboratory situation where it's one place, and then the sort of heroic challenges of installing these large pieces on the top of this building in the harbor of Hong Kong. And so these two projects juxtaposed, they've been really also affecting our thinking with regards to, okay, early on in the process we need to figure out how we're going to make it, and also who is going to be able to make it, and in that you decide basically how do you want to use the budget that you have to make this building and distribute it amongst which group of craftsmen or industries. And to illustrate it, I'm going to show this last project that we just opened in León, in Mexico. It's 3 hours north of Mexico City. It's affordable housing in a city which is one of the fastest growing cities of Mexico. It's actually a lot of the automotive industry has moved there, and it's attracting an incredible amount of people and laborers for the car industry there. And so in Mexico, about half of the population actually lives informally. So they build their own homes, and specifically people that are part of the informal economy and the migrant worker community, they tend to move to the cities where there's work and then build their own home. Infonavit is sort of the national mortgage provider of mortgages similar to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae in the US. They've been trying to figure out how can we help these people towards home ownership. But in their model, they have that they invented, that has been going on for the last sort of decades. the way it's structured, it actually produced this kind of urbanism, very far from the city centers, very simple boxes because it needed to be extremely affordable, a lot of repetition, very monotonous, and mostly very far removed from the city. And it led to very large areas that were pretty much abandoned because the cities themselves couldn't support these, very far located neighborhoods. They couldn't go there for trash pickup. They couldn't bring schools there and security. And so it ended up that many of these cities actually ended up like ghost towns. And so Leon, that you see here on the right, they realized as their city was growing so fast at the periphery, how do we bring these people closer to the urban core, closer to the city center, closer to public transportation, closer to the jobs, and closer to the communities. And we need to figure out a way to build vertically, but at a very, very, economical price point. And how? So this is where we came in. We did some workshops first, and then they asked us to make this prototype. And so how do you translate the street, along which a lot of life happens, into a vertical building? And unfortunately, the most economical way to do that in often is a double-loaded corridor. But the double-loaded corridor is one of the most sort of dreadful, say, journeys, if you want, from the street to your apartment, right? You go into a lobby, into an elevator, you walk in this double-loaded corridor without windows, and then you come to your home. And we felt that the sort of life of the community would really be deadened if we would organize it this way. So we said, well, we need to organize the circulation around a courtyard. We need to create sort of a more open space where also you could see people move through the building. The other challenge of large, affordable housing projects is it becomes very anonymous. You don't know where your house is. You're not sure which window is yours, so to say. Where are you within the building? And so we said, although we're going to make a big building, and I know this building needs to, have a certain presence and announce itself, we also are going to make little parts of it, or sort of it's an assembled by different volumes, so that you can say, well, I live in the tall part over there, or I live in the lower part down there, and that it allows you to sort of identify where your home is. And we worked with the housing authority. Actually, it was a partnership with eMovie, which is the Housing Institute of Leon. We workshopped through with them, and we ended up with this scheme, which has sort of these two courtyards and these different volumes. And then the circulation, which is very important to us, sort of strings these two courtyards together, which you see here. And it means that all the units actually are, can have cross ventilation. So we don't need any AC. It's actually natural ventilation, and the courtyards with their natural draft, basically, they actually produce a lot of ventilation as well. And it also means that everybody has like two ways to sort of go to their home. So you're not always stuck sort of with the same path. You can actually walk in multiple ways. There's staircases here, and there's an additional sort of larger staircase that wraps all the way up and connects some of these exterior sort of patio spaces that happen throughout the building at different levels that the community can gather around. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the labor aspect and this idea of thinking about it. So originally we wanted to make precast concrete panels as the facade. And since since people walk along this path, you have to think about privacy. And so we wanted to create some of these curved panels that allow us to shield so that you can still see in, but that you also produce a little bit of privacy. And we had this idea of making this out of precast concrete panels. And so we presented this, and they were enthusiastic. It met our very tight budget, but they tried to make this concrete panel, and we asked for a mock-up, and they sent us this picture of the mock-up, and they tried many times and in different ways, but at some point we realized maybe they don't want us to succeed, because they always showed sort of this model, this mock-up on the left as well of the brick, and at some point he said, yeah, you know what it is, actually to get the precast we need to drive to a plant 5 hours from here in Guadalajara. It's the only people that can do it. It's only one company that owns that plant. We need to get big trucks to drive for 5 hours to the site. Then we need a crane to install it. And so pretty much to install one panel the way you want it, we can also have 30 people work here on this project for 30 days. And so that made me realize, okay, this is in here, we're actually making a decision not just about what it looks like or what I want, so to say, but actually who gets to participate in the construction of this project. And so we said, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But if we don't have the crane and if we don't have the truck, how do we get the panels in? And so we found that the maximum weight that anybody can carry is 17 kilos on the construction site, just by law. And so we developed this two pieces, actually two blocks with a local cement plant, two custom cement blocks that would allow us to build that wall, and that allow us to take the sort of complex, say, a curvilinear plan and make it in a more sort of fluid way. So the panel itself is actually assembled now and stacked out of a number of these blocks, and they can have various lengths. And then when it rotates, the sort of the corner piece, so to say, this guy is like a hinge piece that allows the window to come in, because the window always needs to sit in there in 90 degrees. And so that gave us a system with which basically they could themselves in a way trace the line of the periphery and just build the walls until a window unit would fit. And it produced a very different texture than the render we showed before, much more hand crafted and actually much more detail and texture, and I think a much softer appearance than what we had originally imagined. And so I'm gonna end, but here you see the project as it was literally a month ago when I was there for the opening, and you see sort of the town and the context where it is. This is also originally sort of the town that grew by itself, and here you see it in its context, the little park. This is one of these outside spaces where the parents can see their kids or yell at their kids when they have to come in for dinner and when they're playing outside. And you see it sort of stepping up to the corner here, which we wanted to give sort of a nice entrance on the corner as a real identity of, like, this is a different type of building. The ground floor units, there's two units for local stores that will be in there, and there's an accessible unit over here. And then every plan is pretty much unique. Here you see the larger courtyard with the staircase that comes up and wraps around and connects sort of these sort of spaces that we were just looking at up here and up here. And there's another one in the other courtyard behind. So here we're looking through. This is a smaller courtyard in the central staircase. And you see that sort of this, how the blocks give a certain orientation and direction. And I think pick up the light in a very nice way. Here you see the very simple apartments, of course. The total construction budget was $2.5 million. That's really very little. Here you have all the windows can open, so actually all the apartments have a lot of light and a lot of air. And here is for the first time we're going to have our name on the building. It's really exciting, but more exciting is the first family, or actually a mom with her son will move in the first unit, and so this is right in the newspaper when I was there. So that's what I have to share. So hopefully it gives something to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Florian. I think we're gonna go ahead and open up to questions. So like I said earlier, you can either raise your hand, you can send the question in the chat, or you can send it directly to either me or Florian. I can go ahead and start off with a question. Even just in the lecture that you just presented, it's pretty evident that you guys work at many different scales, whether that be like, well, master planning, even though it's not master planning, and the scale of the building, and also the scale of the detail. So I'm wondering how sort of your process changes when going at these different projects.
Yeah, I think I don't think the process changes so much. Meaning, I think what what we know basically, or starting to know, right? Because it's all, some of these larger scale things are very new to us, and that's why I also wanted to share them. But it is the space where you can, where the project can live, so to say. Meaning, if you do a very small temporary installation, there are a few things you can work with, but they often have to do with material and material innovation, maybe structure, maybe with how people gather around it. With these larger projects, it becomes immediately much more about which narratives and which stories and which sort of what is the story behind this project to an extent, and who are the people that are included in this story. And I feel we've also been working in, and it came quite a bit actually also from working in Australia. We've been working on a site there. And I think what is very impressive in Australia is that before any meeting, it's acknowledged that the Aboriginal land that this meeting is taking place at, where it's happening. And that made us realize that when you start operating on a very large scale, there's not something as a clean or empty slate, right? You're operating within the world and within society, and you're operating within histories. And so I think that that scale gives a completely different set of ideas that you can work with. So it's more, I would say we approach every project with a desire to really try to have people think differently about the world around us, so to say. So we like to make work that makes people aware of where they are, and so tactility has to do with it, but also these larger stories. So I think maybe the ambition is always the same, but just the way we go about it changes depending on which scale we're working on.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how did your design process change with the advent of the pandemic?
That's a good question. We it's interesting. I would say I didn't like it so much. In a sense, sorry, I switched. I wanted to see, how do I go back to seeing you full screen? Okay, there we go. But at the same time, okay, so we designed one. We actually designed. So there's a few. One is how we design, and the other is what we design. Meaning the process of designing. I would say we had to go suddenly online. We found new ways to share. So for instance, every Monday morning with the whole office, everybody shares what they're working on, and they share about what they're thinking, what are the issues. Because I like to be in a space where everybody in some way feels peripherally what is happening, what somebody else is working on. And once everybody starts working on their own project, maybe me and Jing still know what's going on, but everybody who's just stuck, in their own project has no idea anymore what is happening around them. So the few things we really put into place is how do you share really this office culture? And I started also with the picture of us in the bubble, like how do we maintain that, sort of that people are aware of what's going on. And so we do a lot of, we basically on Monday now share what everybody's dealing with that week, on site or like design wise, whatever. And so we're just sharing that. And then on Thursday, we do a social thing, which is voluntarily that people tend to enjoy. So in some way, we found ways to keep the office culture, but obviously through a different means or a different media. And then interestingly enough, we've been working on some residential projects, and we realized that we really need to think better about how we design homes, because we're not just living there anymore, but we are actually living there, which means we're just there all the time. Or we need to figure out how it's not just a place with a bed and a fridge, so to say, but actually a place that has certain qualities and where you can also be with others, not just together all the time, but also have ways to separate from the people you're with. And I don't know if you guys are living with your family or like with roommates, but in our case, Jing and I, we have 2 kids as well. Everybody had to go to school, play piano, give lectures and do these kind of things. And we realized the loft typology is really the worst typology, because in some way the loft, you all live together in one space and you're constantly confronted with one another. And as we were working on this residential project, we decided that rooms and acoustic separation and sort of the ability to also separate, from others within your space is important, not just being together. So that had an impact basically on mostly the way we think about the way you design a home. I hope that it gave you some some idea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I necessarily have a question, but I was just gonna say there seems to be like a lot of carefulness in terms of construction, means of construction, and sometimes maybe like the limitation of it. You talked about like the weight of being transported or how things are constructed. So what role do you think that plays in your design process?
Well, I think it really has to do with the fact that we started. I don't know. It has. I was not educated here, and I worked in Japan, and at SANAA I learned there is an incredible focus on detail and how you put stuff together. Like just purely the idea. There's not much. Basically, also Japanese architecture is quite light, and so we built always models 1-to-1 scale, and actually the construction of the building was not so much different from the construction of the models, so to say. And this idea that architecture is a real physical sort of activity where it's tactile, you need to do it. It's like I like to describe it as a sport. It's much less with your head, and it's much more sort of, a visceral sort of bodily activity, and understanding, what materials weigh and how, just the idea of assembly, I think is essential for essential part of architecture. But what I'm realizing more and more now is that it's very easy to get removed from all that, especially when you work in Revit or you work, in your computer, and you just 3D print the whole thing. You actually never get confronted with some of these physical, realities. And so I think, we love the digital world, and a lot of people are spending a lot of time in there. But I think architecture is a very, physical act, so to say. And so I feel quite strongly that this is important for students and for architects to be informed by, because at the moment that you stop thinking about the physical realities, you also become somewhat blinded to what it means, right? What these things have as an impact on the people that have to put it together and where the materials come from. And so, I feel specifically now it's quite good to get your hands dirty, so to say.
Luke had a question from the audience that I can read to you.
All right.
He says, I am curious at which stage in the project sustainability becomes one of the main influencing factors.
Well, sustainability is a very broad and complex aspect as well, right? Like, what does it actually mean? Often, so there's a few ways to start thinking about this, and I think for us always the first question is, what is the effect this project can have, right? And so sometimes the effect is a symbolic one or like an inspirational one, right? So it allows you to start a conversation. For instance, I didn't show it this time, but we did a sort of concept home for Milan that was like a sort of nomadic home with a skin that cleans the air, right? So it is wrapped in the skin, and when pollutants go through, it sort of captures the air. And so this project had to do, with can we make, buildings that actually help perform and clean the air? Obviously, it was sort of a concept home and a demonstration home, and in some way, it didn't it's not a home where people can live. It's actually not cleaning the air at the moment, right? So it's not really performing, but it was a project that gained an incredible amount of attention and a lot of conversation that actually opened that conversation about, should we start thinking that way? So that small scale projects for us are always projects that are conversation starters rather than things that need to perform themselves. Larger scale, you need to really actually start thinking, what is the impact of this, as we work on it? So I think it's very important to first figure out, are we going to have, what sort of impact can we have? It's ultimately very clear that it's best to not build or to use what is already there, right? But not building, is the same as saying not living or not being. So it's more like, if you're going to spend the energy, if you're going to spend the time, what is the most efficient way in which we can do that, or the least harmful way in which we can do that? Sometimes it is not building, sometimes it is building smaller, sometimes it is using what is there, but it needs a lot of creativity. So I would say it's very hard to say at what moment do you start thinking about it. I think we start immediately, or like it's just naturally there. And I think it's, yeah, so I don't know if that's a good, basically from the beginning, maybe that's enough of an answer, but yeah. But I think you have to be very careful that it doesn't mean that you, like, for instance, we did a private home that wasn't built, and we were about to start construction, and the client said, so what is green about this house, right? And it was a weekend house up like a couple of hours north of New York. And they hadn't shared with us the desire to make it green, but they said, well, can we not put some solar panels on the roof or something? And I said, well, if you're interested in solar, it's probably better to get your, solar energy from Arizona rather than from, upstate New York with this little panel. And the most sort of sustainable thing to do, apart from not building the house, is not going 3 weekends to your weekend house. You would save, so much energy by just literally just staying 3 weekends, in New York. It's going to be, way more efficient than any energy that this house will ever be able to generate, which means it is a fundamental change of how we deal with these things. So I think you have to be careful that you're going to learn a lot of sustainable tricks, so to say, to keep a certain way of living, where I feel the scale in which some of these changes need to take place is much larger, and we have to just think differently about how we live on the, here. I do think there's going to be a lot of work for all of you there if you think about that smartly, and if you have, if you are able to develop sort of knowledge and expertise around it. But be critical, right? Don't just greenwash everything and just plaster everything with solar panels that are going to run only for 10 years, and then they end up in the waste bin again.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
I have one more question about like the green aspect.
All right.
Have you ever changed the structure of a building or the form of it to be more conducive to like green and sustainable living, or is that more in the materials that you're utilizing?
You mean, so for instance, Leon, the project we showed, the housing project, we really wanted to avoid machines. Machines, basically, if you can avoid machines in your building, you're going a long way. What we're dealing with now, mostly what we see is that there's projects that are triggered by the fact that the machines stop working. So we're involved now in 2 museum renovations. The museums actually, as buildings, are fine. The mechanical systems are broken because mechanical systems, they go 20 years maybe, right? And then you need to upgrade them. What is sad but true, museums, they cannot raise money for a new air handling unit, right? Like a donor, they don't want to have their name on the air handling unit or on a chiller plant. They want their name on a new gallery or a new, lobby or a new space. So what is happening now is that these museums are building new buildings, not to build their new buildings, but to upgrade their facility plan, right? And so if you would either, like, I think it's really, and people find it very boring, but if you can learn more about mechanical systems, right, this is actually where you can extend the lifespan of your building much longer. Brick, gravity I say is quite stable. Gravity is going to be here with us for a long time. So if you make your building super robust, and allow it to just stand for a very long time, but make it very easy. Well, actually, just try to avoid machines, really, if you can, right? Try to find natural ventilation. So that's what we tried in Leon. In Leon, there's literally, there's not a single machine really in there. There's solar boilers on the roof. So actually they heat their water, on the roof with sun. It's possible in that climate. Every climate has different opportunities. So I think it's not that you can find a solution that works everywhere. The other thing I should say is we've been really trying to build in wood structure, but it's not allowed. For instance, in New York, you cannot build in timber, but in other places you can. And I think what is important is that we learn from what happens in other regions. And what we're trying to do now is actually take some of the knowledge, because in Europe they're becoming quite good in mass timber. Like, how can we bring that knowledge here to New York, and how can we convince this, basically the local government, and I should say also the local union, to allow for alternatives, because there is a lot of money going around in steel and concrete industries, and there's a lot of people very afraid that an alternative industry will take some of their market away. So there's a lot of pushback, and that is something you will find but you should not give up once you start working. You'll hear, well, that's just the way it is, right? And there are a lot of things that are the way they are, but they shouldn't necessarily be that way. And it just takes, this continuous pressure. So we're trying in every project to see how can we push, a little bit here and there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If there's no more questions from the audience, I guess that concludes our lecture and Q&A.
All right. Normally we go for a beer now, but that's unfortunate. We cannot do that. But
Hey, if you happen to come next semester, definitely.
I'll let you know. You owe me a little beer there. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Florian. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you guys. Thank you for inviting. Take care. Bye-bye.